Hello, everybody. My name is Graham Elwood, and you are watching The Political Vigilante. Very special guest returning to the show from Watchdog. It's Tarek Haddad, who just covered the first 4 days of the Julian Assange extradition hearing. Tarek, how you doing today?
Very good. Thanks for having me on. Appreciate to be back.
I really appreciate you taking the time. I know last week was pretty nuts. I had a couple interviews with Taylor Hudak and just watching all the work. I watched some of your live stream that you did every day. So what can you tell our audience about, first of all, kind of overall, you were actually in the courtroom all 4 days, which is significant. And so kind of give us an overview, what you saw happening in the first 4 days, and kind of, it sounded like, and you can go into more detail, obviously, that actually the Julian's defense team actually established a pretty solid footing. But why don't you get into the details on that?
Yeah, I have to say that Julian's defense team throughout the week were excellent. Very on the point. The cases they raised were, very well argued and all that kind of thing. Unfortunately, and I kind of was someone that wanted to avoid having this perspective but it was something that I'd read about from previous hearings and so on. I left the week with a very strong impression that it's going to be a very, uphill battle for Julian, regardless of the legal arguments. And I can give you maybe just a very quick example of, because the week was filled with lots of different things going on. Lots of things were discussed. It started off with the prosecutors laying out their case, and then the defense kind of rebutting some of those, and then we got into long kind of 2-day arguments about the extradition treaty. So those were kind of, and we can get into some of those details, but one very kind of telling moment about at the very end of the week, which sort of kind of sums this whole process up, is that I'm sure you read about it. Julian had this moment where he stood up in court and he started to address the judge, saying that he wasn't gaining, or he doesn't have access to his lawyers or sufficient access. All of his, communication was being monitored or spied on. And so he was kind of requesting, and through his lawyers, they were requesting for him to sit in the alongside his lawyers, so outside of the dock. So for people that haven't been following so closely, he's been in a sort of bulletproof dock in the back of the courtroom. You have to remember that Belmarsh prison is a maximum security prison. Usually the types of cases in there will be for high profile terrorists. So it's very, it's set up in that way where he's completely cut off from the proceedings. A lot of the time he couldn't hear what was going on.
Well, I got to interject on this. That to me seems so deliberate to put him in this steel, this bulletproof thing, like he's some crazy terrorist or serial killer or some that's obviously, in my opinion, and you can say what you think about this, but in my opinion, that's more of like making, oh, Julian's an evil terrorist. He's not just some journalist, because and that's what they have to try to claim, because if he is just a journalist, because if he is guilty, then we need to posthumously have a court case with Ben Bradley for releasing the Pentagon Papers. I mean, this is what is so maddening to me, and the fact that they're doing these clear propagandized, theatrics, really, to just have the average person who's not paying as much attention as you are or I am to go, oh, wow, I guess he's a crazy terrorist because he's in that same terrorist box that they use at Belmarsh prison.
And it's not only, things like the Pentagon Papers, it's things that are going published in the New York Times almost every day. That would be prosecuted. But we had these arguments for him to come. And I guess a relevant case here in the UK, I don't know if you're familiar with the name Tommy Robinson. He is the leader of the EDL, which is the English Defence League. He had been convicted of assaulting a police officer. And yet, despite that, which is, just to kind of be very specific, that's a violent crime. Despite that, he was able to go and sit next to his lawyers during some later court proceedings. The lawyers for Julian Assange had argued that, and correctly argued that there was precedent for the defense to be able to sit with their lawyers. They told, based on the government's own reports in the United Kingdom, that access to justice was reduced if in these circumstances, and that under, I believe, the UN's guidelines of fair court proceedings, having this kind of glass setup dramatically decreased the chances of being found not guilty of something. I forget the actual statistic, but what was very telling is that we had about half a day's arguments about this. The judge listened, seemed like she was paying attention, and then she read from a piece of paper that she had brought into court prior to the arguments. So everyone in the courtroom, or people that were paying attention, quickly realized that she had made her decision before the arguments were made. That just shows you the level of corruption in these hearings. And that's, I could go into lots of the legal specifics, but I think that's just a very clear example of some of the things that we're facing in this case.
So, before we get into some more legal specifics, I just want to say, so you saw Julian, have you seen him in person before? And how did he look?
So yeah, I went to some of his earlier hearings in London. To me, because I wasn't able to cover it at the times that, there was a lot of the torture allegations going on. The first time that I saw him in December, I believe it was, I reported that he was looking a lot better than he had been. So, I heard that he was looking very weak, was struggling to, it was after all those stories started to come out that, he was struggling to speak and he was slurring his words. He looked okay most of the time, to be honest. Obviously, he's going through a lot, and I think it just speaks more to him as a person. I think he's someone is very aware of the position that he's in. He's someone that's extremely well read. I think I was researching a piece for another some information for an article. He was reading Alexander Solzhenitsyn, at a very young age. He's the Russian political prisoner, and he joked about, and this was when he was about 25. He joked, how similar is his life to mine? And he has no idea. I guess that prophecy came true in a very big way. Now he's 47 or 48, I believe. He's someone that's very aware of the circumstance, so he knows that this is probably the type of treatment that he's going to get. But he still seemed resilient. He would, at the end of every day, he would raise his fist to the public gallery. He had some, and I was fortunate enough to meet some of them. Some of his very close and long friends that he's known for a long time managed to come in, and one of them was Jeremy Zimmerman, kind of a famous hacktivist and cypherpunk. I had the pleasure of speaking to him, and it really put things into perspective for me too, because they've been following this for a long time, and you really kind of see the process that they've been through in all of this as well. So that was a very kind of nice moment for me, because it really kind of reminded me why I wanted to cover these hearings. And I set up this watchdog media operation to make sure that there was good, accurate coverage from the hearings. So we did a kind of a daily news report and a nightly podcast. And at the very last day, that was when I spoke to Jeremy, and it really kind of was, reminded me of kind of at the end of this long, stressful week where we had that evidence of, corruption. It kind of fueled my fire again at a time when I was feeling a little bit down about the whole situation. So, that's kind of been my feeling throughout all of this, is that it's very, very negative, but there are always kind of these signs of optimism to cling on to. I have to mention that the support for Julian was absolutely incredible. We had people from all over the world who came and camped out outside Belmarsh.
Wow.
In tents. They were there every single day. It was 0 degrees. It was snowing at certain points of the week in London, and they were there singing and chanting the entire week. And it was, you know, really uplifting to see.
So let's get into then some of that is impressive, and I think that it needs this kind of coverage, because there wasn't much coverage here in the States about it, quite honestly. I mean, you know, everything's all talking about this primary and the never-ending election cycle that is American politics. It's just like sports or professional wrestling or some ridiculous thing like that. But let's get into some of the specific things you saw the defense put out there that gave you some hope. And I want to ask about this. I know Cassandra Fairbanks, that Political article came out, and then she went on Periscope to basically reveal this phone conversation. Did the defense use that at all? And I know there was talk of maybe what Dana Rohrabacher had said. So what of those items did the defense use that you thought were helpful?
Yeah. I mean, I'll use any opportunity like you to stick the boot into the sort of more mainstream media where I can. That Politico article was slightly inaccurate. It was so it had said something like along the lines that the details of this Rohrbacher meeting was going to come in that week, but because they've not been following the case so closely, they didn't know that first week was purely kind of legal arguments about the extradition treaty. It's in May when we're going to start having all of the sort of witness statements and the evidence. So we had mention of those things. So we are going to have Cassandra Fairbanks' evidence in May, and I think that's why she preempted releasing it, because she's, you know, once her name was mentioned in that Politico article, she started receiving a lot of scrutiny, and she just wanted to preempt it. The other thing we're going to receive in May is a written statement from Jennifer Robinson, who's one of Assange's lawyers. She was present in the Ecuadorian embassy at the time of that meeting with Rohrbacher. So she's going to give further information about that meeting. So I've just actually published a piece about 10 minutes ago before coming on here about that, about Kim.com's revelations and the revelations that came out from Cassandra Fairbank, and then tying that together with what came out of court. So if people want to kind of get the full picture of that, that's there.
And where would they go get that?
That's on thewatchdog.net.
Thewatchdog.net. Okay, so before we get into kind of what's going to happen in May, since the bulk of this, you said this last week, was about the extradition, and a lot of it was the extradition treaty between America and the UK. Can you go give us, explain that to us? Because I'm assuming, myself, I'm not that much up to speed with it, and I'm assuming many of my viewers don't quite know what it is. So can you tell us what that is specifically?
So basically, it's, you know, I don't think it's too complicated to understand, is that there's a international treaty between the United States and the United Kingdom for you know, for extradition of prisoners for certain crimes. Now, it gets a little bit confusing is that there is the extradition treaty, which is 2003, and then in the United Kingdom, there's also a separate extradition act, which was also 2003. So the Extradition Act is kind of the UK's own internal laws for extradition. And the treaty is just governing how it manages that with the US, and that was ratified in 2007. So there is the Act and then the treaty. In the Act, the British Act, actually I'll do it the other way around. In the US-UK extradition, there is, as there is with many different treaties across the world on extradition, there is a defense or a safeguard against extraditions for political prisoners. It's Article 4.1. It's kind of a very old and very common safeguard, because obviously political prisoners, you know, that can be abused for human rights purposes, that kind of thing.
Which
the
America
lawyer,
claims to care about,
which America
but they
gets to
don't.
claim about. But what's interesting is that the lawyers for the prosecution, representing the U.S. government, tried to argue in court that the treaty does not apply in this case, but we should only be considering the United Kingdom's Extradition Act, which is separate to the UK. So they're trying to argue in very legalese terms that the treaty is kind of the framework, but it's only what the UK says is relevant, and that because that law doesn't say anything about political prisoners, that's why it's convenient to them. But it's completely kind of circle-minded logic, because the extradition the request that they're making is dependent on the treaty, and they're trying to argue that the act, we should follow the act. But the reason the act doesn't say anything is that you have to remember that the UK has extradition treaties with lots of different countries. So one treaty might have a political prisoner defense, one might not. So the act is silent on that. So it kind of gives the flexibility for the UK to just abide by the treaty. What the prosecution is trying to argue is that it was specifically left out because United Kingdom law is not intended to have that political defense, which is circle-minded. And like I told you with the evidence regarding Julian coming to sit with his lawyers, even though the prosecution's argument is completely sort of, circular and illogical, they didn't receive any sort of pushback from the judge, but the defense got accused of circular thinking for arguing that the extradition should follow the extradition treaty, and not only the extradition treaty, it should follow the European Convention of Human Rights and international humanitarian law, which the prosecution were trying to argue does not take bearing onto these court hearings. It was absolutely, I think at the time I didn't even, because we were kind of drowning in legal speak, that we didn't, it was difficult to pick up on that. But now, you can, once you kind of sit back, you can kind of clearly identify what's going on in this case.
Wow.
And, for people that follow the Assange hearings, these kind of things just are something it's just a commonality in his case. There's been so many flagrant violations of international law and of normal court proceeding and of due process, that things like this just seem like a blip in the ocean. But that's what happens in this case. It's just a continual breaking down of law and order. That's why I think it's such a symbolic case, because the people that are prosecuting him don't realize the amount of precedents they're setting on so many different levels. They're just, due process has completely been thrown out of the window. And I think the feeling that I got, and kind of discussing with some of the other people, is that I think in this case it's going to be just as much outside the courtroom that's what's important than inside, because inside looks like it's not going to be, we're going to have the result that is justice, essentially. So I think it's going to depend more on lots of people putting political pressure on their representatives, etc.
Yeah, well, that's a great point. It's everybody out there watching. We can't just sit back and hope that we get a fair trial, because that's not happening. It's never happened with him. It will not happen. And you already said the judge, she made her decision before any arguments were even spoken. So for everybody out there watching, this is a thing to lean on your representatives hard to put pressure on this, and which brings us to May, because we have some time to put as much political pressure on. Now, what you saw introduced in this first week, and now May is going to be anywhere from 3 to 4 weeks or something?
Yeah. Scheduled for 3 weeks, but it could run on for longer.
Okay. Or they could shorten it, or however they want to do that. Because this was supposed to be longer and they shortened it, correct?
Yeah, it was only a day though. It wasn't anything malicious. It was just that both sides had got through what they wanted, what was scheduled for that week prior to.
Okay, that makes sense. All right. So based on everything you talked about, the stuff that you've seen, and we're going to have, as you said in May, eyewitness testimony from, Cassandra Fairbanks and people like that in favor of Julian, and who knows what the prosecution is going to bring up. How do you see this, playing out in May?
It's difficult to say. I mean, every single day was a different kind of journey of long details. So it's, you have to remember we're there from kind of 10 o'clock till 4:35 every day, just purely listening to the lawyers go back and forth. And you never know, something can just happen in 1 minute, like we were there listening to these very sort of sleepy legal arguments for about 2 hours. And, probably most of the journalists had fallen asleep in the room. But then we had this moment where Julian Assange just sort of stood up and addressed the court in very dramatic circumstances, and you could just hear all the keyboards and like everyone was scrambling and like trying to figure out what he said and everything. So it's really tough to say, but I think we'll get evidence from the prosecution probably trying to argue that the disclosures that WikiLeaks and Julian Assange put out caused harm in some respects. They tried to argue things like because Osama bin Laden had found WikiLeaks materials in his caves, or complete nonsense arguments. I mean, what if Osama bin Laden just so happened to be reading the New York Times when the raid happened?
What if he was a Manchester United fan? Are they going to be pulled into this? Like, come on. I
mean, yeah, it's just clearly ridiculous. Anyone with an internet connection can access WikiLeaks. That doesn't mean, there are going to be bad people that read it. There's going to be good people that read it. And we have to remember that the amount of influence that WikiLeaks has had on academics, on researchers, on journalists, on human rights advocates, on so many different across the entire world, that yes, some of his material will be read and probably will fuel radical thinking for people that dislike US government policy. But the problem should probably be thought about is that it's, the US government policy. That's what is making people radicalized. It's not that Julian Assange is providing them this information. It's the policies behind all of it.
Yeah, that's okay. So, well, I look forward to talking with you more about this, and to my viewers out there, I'm going to try to maybe go for that last week in May if I can, just to cover this, because I'd really like to be there, seeing what was happening, and having been involved with this for a while. So where can people get? Because I know you probably have a wealth of material that you will be releasing like in the next week or so. So where can people watch Watchdog Media?
Yeah, I think the easiest thing is probably the watchdog.net. I'm going to try and kind of make that a central depository for all the information, but we've got a Twitter, which is WD Newswire, and a YouTube page, the Watchdog. So, but I'm going to try and kind of collate everything in a central place. I'm also going to do a sort of a long news report that's just a summary of the whole week, and I'll have in all the different tweets and videos and news articles, just kind of making it a very accessible document for the week. And then probably try and produce that on a weekly basis, so that kind of people that can't follow all the ins and outs can just sort of get a 1 week summary of everything that's happened.
Okay, excellent. Well, Tarek, thank you so much for taking time out of your day, and thank you for doing that work last week, man. I know that was like, talking to several of the people that were there. I know it was an emotional thing, and it would be just watching video outside of Belmarsh Prison. I was like, it affected me. I can't imagine what actually standing outside of it, let alone being in the courtroom, seeing Julian Assange, how that would feel, man.
Yeah, it was. I mean, it was definitely a tough week, but also a very kind of, I learned a lot from it about the hearings, and from a personal perspective. But yeah, like I say, there's positive signs going forward, and I think if you do come in May, it'll be a great experience for you. And I think the thing that was really beneficial to me was that I was able to make a lot of good connections with people that I hadn't come across. You know, you get to meet everyone that's involved with this. And I think what's happening now is that all these people that are involved in WikiLeaks are starting to kind of make networks and so on. And we're all kind of collectively building on what, you know, Julian has achieved with WikiLeaks, but, you know, we're building on that in terms of fighting for him, but also, you know, there's seems to be so many people that are creating different solutions to these problems, which is really exactly what we need. You know, instead of people complaining and saying how screwed up the whole world is, there seems to be people just kind of getting on with trying to actually make solutions, which I think is the only thing that we should be doing.
Yeah, I mean that model is that model, multiple people getting involved, coming up with new solutions, different solutions, a bunch of different solutions working at the same time. That's the solution for climate change, for, I mean, you name it, man. Election reform, I mean, going up against the ruling class. I mean, that's what it's going to take, because we can't just sit there and go, oh boy, this is bad, and all I'm going to do is vote. That ain't enough.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's one of those things where if you look at a problem at a grand scale, it obviously looks extremely unsolvable. And so I think that's the approach to take, is that if, you know, each person just focuses on a very specific small issue that they can solve, or with a team of people they can solve, they don't understand how much of an actual wider impact it has, because, you know, all these things kind of start to fit together and we can all chip away at things slowly. You know, we're not going to solve the problem of US politics or climate change with, you know, overnight. So, yeah, it just takes these little kind of steps in the right direction.
Yeah, but it's everyone starts getting up, everyone stands up, everyone takes a step, and all of a sudden it becomes a really bigger movement. I mean, you know, I was at this Bernie Sanders rally in Los Angeles last night. There was probably 15,000 people there, and I know he publicly hasn't said anything about Julian Assange. From people I talked to within his campaign, just in my personal opinion, he's going to pardon him if he becomes president. He's just not going to say it now, because it's anyway, we don't have to have that discussion, but like, I'm just saying, I'm seeing more and more people get involved in a bunch of different things. I've been to the anti-Iran war protests last month. I've been to Sunrise Movement. And I'm seeing more and more people who are like getting involved and bringing their kids down, and what can I do? How can I help? I have a full-time job. I can't go to London, and it's like, great, but you can support these shows. You can support what you're doing, because this costs money. What you did this past week costs money. I mean, Taylor, who I interviewed, all these other journalists from all over the world, it costs money. Like, so there's a lot of ways for people to get involved to help this. So support what Tarek is doing. And support what we're doing here at Political Vigilante, and hopefully I will be there in London in May.
I look forward to seeing you.
All right, man. Thanks for being on the show. Like, share, and subscribe, everybody. Spread these videos out there. Go to GrahamElwood.com. Join the Patreon, the Rockfin, and come see us on the road. Thanks for watching.